Hong Kong protests are stirring up debate about index allocations to China, which is still classified as an emerging market, although changes could be coming soon. With us now to discuss is Perth Tolle. She's the founder at Life and Liberty Indexes. The Life and Liberty Freedom 100 Emerging Markets Index is a freedom-weighted emerging market equity strategy. You use human and economic freedom metrics to talk about your investment selection process. I guess for you right now, it must be a really busy time to keep track of all the changes.
Yes, so we've seen a lot of interest in divesting from China, and a lot of these emerging market funds that are market capitalization weighted have 30 to 35% direct exposure to China. So we've seen some interest in divesting from those types of allocations into something more like what we do, and what we do is basically a freedom-weighted approach. So we don't arbitrarily exclude China. We just have no China in the allocation right now because it's freedom-weighted, and the higher freedom countries get a higher weight, the lower freedom countries get a lower weight, and the worst offenders as far as human rights and economic freedoms are excluded from the index. So currently we have no China, Russia, Egypt, or Saudi Arabia.
Are you monitoring right now or observing any outflows from these Chinese ETFs or any China-related or weighted index funds right now?
Yeah, I don't monitor the outflows, but I can get that information for you. But what we have seen is a lot of investment offices, whether it's family offices or hedge funds or institutions, looking at having this conversation. Should we be divesting from this? Do our clients really know that they have 30 to 35% in China out of their broad emerging market index funds? And is that something that they would approve of or want to have if they knew that? So it's a fiduciary conversation that's going on right now that I see.
What does the conversation sound like? I mean, we've had this debate now this year, the difficulty of companies maybe choosing profit over morality, right? Especially when it comes to the issue of Hong Kong and you know, folks in the NBA, for example, speaking out on the investment side of things. Is it as black and white as that?
So absolutely, it's not really black and white. I don't think it's a difficult conversation because China is a participant in global markets, and you do want to, you know, keep that trade going. We don't penalize freer markets that trade with China for doing that free trade. So we have a lot of markets in our index like Chile, Taiwan, South Korea that do trade a lot with China and invest in China, or South Africa as well. You can't get away from that indirect China exposure, so that will always be there. But we just don't have the direct China exposure.
And so are emerging indexes overly exposed to China right now?
I would say emerging market indexes that are market capitalization weighted are pretty concentrated in China because they have between, if you look at MSCI and FTSE, there's between 30 to 35% in China currently. MSCI is in the process of quadrupling their A shares allocation in their emerging markets index. FTSE already has A shares, so they actually have more A shares than MSCI right now. So that's a lot in one country. That's direct exposure. And in addition, you have all the indirect exposure as well. So I would say, yeah, a lot of people aren't aware of that overconcentration in one country.
There's a lot of talk about fairness here in the U.S., especially when it comes to the president and where he sees China in the global market, and a lot of things that he believes that China is doing is unfair. Is it still fair to call China an emerging market?
Yeah,
who calls it? I mean, who really sits there and decides like what is an emerging market and what's not? I mean, a lot of it comes down to GDP breakout, how much of your GDP comes from services. So I guess it still hasn't tipped the scale yet.
Yeah, so FTSE and MSCI both agree that China is an emerging markets index constituent. So they do kind of set the standard on that. Yeah, whether it should be an emerging market, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, when you're the #2 economy by GDP, it's interesting to still be classified as that. So I think it's a very fair question.
But I don't think it's all just the size. I think it's also like their capital controls, their institutions, and some of those still need to improve.
Yeah, and again, I think the foundation, right, I think the U.S. is like 75% services-driven economy, and so whatever, tier one. But I mean, the fact that you have an entire you know, index and you look at your selection process based on this human factor is pretty novel and notable among other investors. You know, I mean, ESG obviously has been around for a little while, but how do you also become objective to the human, you know, because everybody has a different view of what is I mean, maybe not so freedoms so much, but there could be nuances.
Yeah, so especially in ESG, there's a lot of nuances and everyone has a different view. So as far as freedom metrics, we use only quantitative metrics, and our metrics come from think tanks. So we partner with third-party think tanks. We work with the Cato Institute, the Fraser Institute, and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. They have a joint project called the Human Freedom Index and Dataset, which is a combination of 79 variables of human and economic freedoms, encompassing the rights to life, liberty, and property. So we use that.
What prompted you to even focus on freedom as a selection criteria in the first place?
Yeah, so I grew up in both China and the US, and I saw the difference that freedom made in my life, and as well as in the markets of these countries. And then I worked at Fidelity for 10 years as a financial advisor, and I had a lot of clients in California and Texas that were non-native, that were from Russia, from China, and they didn't want to invest in those countries for this reason. So I wanted to create something where I can invest in emerging markets without this overexposure to China and some of these other very unfree places, and have that option for investors as well.
Absolutely. Well, very timely conversation. We thank you for joining us and breaking down the philosophy behind the Life and Liberty Indexes. That's Perth Tolle, who is the founder of the Life and Liberty Indexes here on Cheddar.